Many people can name the three most prominent religions throughout Chinese history, being Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And while many people know of Buddhism's origin in India, they may also believe that the religions of Confucianism and Taoism have always been dominant in China. However, before the rise of Confucianism, Taoism, and other religions which rose during the 100 schools of thought, there was the religion and rites of the Zhou Dynasty. The rites and beliefs of the Zhou Dynasty would be highly influential on the more standardized systems that would follow, such as Confucianism and Taoism. With all that being said, we will now look at the religion of the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou dynasty rose to become the rulers of China after the Battle of Muye, in which they defeated the ruling Shang dynasty. However, not long after this great victory, the Zhou would be in a period of regency, as the previous king had died unexpectedly, leaving a child heir. The regent for this child king would be Dan, the Duke of Zhou, or just the Duke of Zhou, as he is often known. The Zhou, although having come to reign over China through force, did not want to rule through force alone, especially as the possibility of a Shang restoration was looming over their heads. So the Duke of Zhou would go out to the people of Shang, such as their former officials, giving speeches about how Tian, or heaven in Chinese, had granted the Zhou a mandate to rule over the lands formerly belonging to the Shang. Tian was an entity unknown to the Shang. Shang had their own supreme spiritual entity which could influence the course of human events, being Di. The Zhou would not forget about Di, as in many texts of the Zhou period, such as the Book of Poetry and the Classic of Documents, both Di and Tian are mentioned. However, there is a discrepancy in the number of uses of both terms. In the Book of Poetry, there are 118 mentions of the term Tian. This does not include mentions of the royal term Son of Heaven, while there are only 43 combined mentions of the terms Di/Shang Di. As for the Classic of Documents, there are 116 uses of Tian and only 25 mentions of Shang Di/Di, thus bringing us back to the Duke of Zhou, who only mentioned Di/Shang Di when speaking to the Shang people, and in fact combines Di and Tian in one instance, saying August Tian Shang Di. All of this is to say that the Zhou, at the very least, presented Tian as synonymous with Di as the supreme being to be worshipped above the rest. Having covered Tian's introduction into China, it is important to give more details about Tian. As has been noted previously, Tian was the supreme god of the Zhou religion. In the Zhou Li, it is stated, by the sacrifice offered with wholeheartedness, the king worships grand heaven, the supreme god. However, much about Tian is very vague. Tian was a type of man in the sky, as can be seen from his character in Chinese. Tian could be used in a more philosophical or literal meaning, depending on the context, with later Zhou religious texts using Tian more philosophically. However, Tian could also be a place, such as the literal sky, and be used to refer to the former rulers of the Zhou, since they resided there. Among these aspects, there is also Tian's role as a ruler. This aspect of Tian rulership was most relevant to the Zhou. The king, as Tian's chosen one, was known as Tianzi, or Son of Heaven. The Zhou connected the rise and fall of the Xia, Shang, and their own dynasty with Tian's mandate. The rulers of the Xia and Shang first started out as moral paragons, and as such were granted the right to rule by Tian. However, when they became morally bankrupt, Tian withdrew its sanction of these dynasties and bestowed its mandate on a new morally upright dynasty. This is the concept we in the West know as the mandate of heaven. Rulers must punish crime and know when to offer clemency in order to maintain Tian's favor. Part of keeping a morally upright regime was keeping a good cabinet of ministers. Part of the Xia and Shang's loss of mandate was that their ministers were oppressive. Although Tian was the highest and most supreme being to be worshipped, it was not the only being which received worship. There were three classes of deities, or things to be offered worship: the heavenly spirits, terrestrial deities, and human ancestors. The second in line to Tian were the sun and moon. Yuan Nanzi, which although it was written around 139 BC, is influenced by earlier late Zhou era writings, refers to the sun and the moon as agents of Tian. Eclipses of the sun were seen as signs of bad government and thus possible loss of the mandate. After the sun would come the stars, planets, and celestial phenomena such as wind and rain. All of these would have a part to play in the governing of the universe. The highest of the terrestrial spirits were the spirits of soil and grain, known as Xie in Chinese. One tradition is that the personalized form of the soil is the earth goddess known as Hua Tu, and the personalized form of grain being the lord of millet, Hua Ji. Hua Ji is of particular interest to the Zhou because he is claimed to be their founding ancestor. Hua Ji's origin is supposedly that when his mother stepped into the footprint of Tian, he was conceived. Hua Ji is also credited with giving grain to the people and establishing the sacrifices related to agriculture. The earth spirits after these were the recipients of the 5 sacrifices, being Gomang, the spirit of the spring, Ju Rong, the spirit of the summer, Ru Shou, the spirit of the autumn, Zhuan Ming, the spirit of winter, and the previously mentioned Po Tu was considered part of the deities which received one of the 5 sacrifices. Go Rong had the face of a human, but the body of a bird. According to the Zhou Li Zhu Shu, Go Mong was the son of the legendary emperor Xiao Hao. Zhu Rong acts on the orders of Yan Di to regulate Shang, the lesser spirits. Ru Shou was the uncle or son of Xiao Hao, as well as being one of his assistant spirits. Ru has a snake in his left ear, rides 2 dragons, has white hair, and the claws of a tiger. He was the deity of punishment, and wielded an axe as a symbol of his jurisdictional power. Ru Shou also ruled the region of the west. Along the Kunlun range, Jian Ming was the assistant of the mythical emperor Jian Zhu. They both ruled the northern regions. Xuan Ming, according to a fragment of the book Feng Su, Tong Yi, was the controller of rain. Also, according to the Zhou Li Zhu Shu, Zhuan and Ming were actually separate and sons of the emperor Xiao Hao. And now we come to the final category of lesser deity, and arguably the most famous, human ancestors. Human ancestors could serve a similar position to Tian. Ancestors could help their descendants if pleased by them, and could punish terribly if displeased. Zhou rulers would have to not only make sacrifices to their ancestors, but also do divinations to determine their wealth. If a Zhou king was a particularly successful ruler, they could join the ranks of their ancestors. Zhou officials and kings were often motivated by their ancestors in a secular sense, as government positions were often passed down within families, making descendants feel a great sense of pressure and honor to be in the same place as their ancestor. With all of these deities and spirits, it is only natural there would be a system of sacrificial worship in place for all of them. According to the Zhou Li, the Minister of Rites was charged with overseeing the rites performed throughout the Zhou Dynasty. His main function was to see that all the rites were performed properly, as some rites could only be performed by the royal family. One such rite was sacrifices made to Tian. The Zhou Li described the sacrifices made to Tian as offered with wholeheartedness, as has been previously mentioned. The next sacrifices the Zhou Li list are the sacrifices of the sun, moon, stars, and zodiac, which are made using piled up faggots. By burning wooden stacks, the commander of winds and rains is worshipped. With blood sacrifice, the king worships Huo Tu and Huo Ji, as well as the spirits of the 5 sacrifices in the 5 sacred mountains. By burning the soil, the king worships the spirits of mountains, forests, rivers, and lakes. By opening and beheading the sacrificial victims, the king worships the 4 regions and 100 objects. Tribute is made to former and ancestral kings by libations made at the moment the sacrificial animal is brought in. Tribute is also made to former kings by offering grains. The funeral rites are to express mourning about the deceased and vanished. The calamity rites are to express mourning over bad harvests and epidemics. The inauspicious rites serve to express mourning over the kingdom and regional states. The consolidation rites serve to express mourning over calamities and natural disasters. The societal rites serve to mourn over defeats in battle and sieges. The rites of pity serve to mourn over robbery and disorder. The hospitality rites serve to provide friendly approaches between the kingdom and regional states. Now that we have finished my paraphrasing of the Zhou Li, let's expand on the use of sacrifices and their victims. Sacrifices to all ancestors from the founding of the Zhou to the most recent was limited to the main branch of the Zhou family, while cadet branches could only sacrifice to the founder of their branch as well as their 5 most recently deceased family heads. During ceremonies where sacrifices were made to ancestors, music was often played. The libations made when paying tribute to ancestral kings would be alcoholic. The Zhou believed the constant intoxication of Shang kings was part of their great decadence which lost them the mandate. Thus, the Zhou restricted the use of alcohol to only religious occasions. When one thinks of the Shang and ritual sacrifice, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is often their use of human sacrifice. The Zhou did initially practice human sacrifice, however to a much smaller extent than that of the Shang. In fact, during the spring and autumn period, it began to be said that the spirit of Dan, the Duke of Zhou, would not accept human sacrifices to show how virtuous he is. One instance of human sacrifice during the Zhou Dynasty that is particularly interesting is the case of General Yu. Yu had won captive chieftains, 5,049 severed ears or heads, and more than 13,081 men. After interrogating the chieftains, They are decapitated and the severed ears/heads are then burned as sacrifices. It should be noted that sacrifices of this specific nature only appear once in the history of the Zhou. Often, alongside humans, animals would accompany their masters into death. During the early Zhou, dogs, horses, and on rare occasions, 2 humans would be sacrificed as companions for deceased lords. Sheep, cattle, and pigs would also be sacrificed in both large and small groups. According to the Yi Li, during royal sacrifices, each tripod was sold with a different type of meat. Beef, which filled the largest, lamb, pork, fish, dried meat, tripe, skin, fresh fish, and fresh dry meat. Fresh fish and fresh dry meat were not allowed to be used by regional rulers. Grand masters were not allowed beef, so their largest tripod contained lamb. Servicemen were allowed pork, fish, and dried meat or lamb. The vessels which held sacrifices would have meaning as well. Vessels could depict ideas of virtuous leadership to show the king was deserving to rule. We now come to our final section in our look at Zhou Dynasty religion. Tombs and burial practices. Unfortunately, no tombs of any Zhou kings have been found, but we can rely on the tombs of regional rulers and dignitaries to get a picture of what funeral rites were like during the Zhou. The structure of Zhou tombs consisted of 1 or 2 ramps leading into the tomb chamber. The longer of the 2 ramps was perhaps used to bring down the coffin as well as goods. The short ramp may have been used for the audience of the funeral. The tomb would be filled with various grave goods, with the amount depending on the social status of the occupant. The bronze vessels and tombs have actually shown that during the period of the Western Zhou, bronze vessel casting was standardized. The number of human servants accompanying their lord to the grave was vastly reduced, as previously noted, with only a few concubines, consorts, servants, and musicians. Destroyed weapons, such as chariots, but also others, were common in Zhou-era tombs. According to the Li Ji, the head of the dead is oriented to the north to allow their soul to go to the northern dwelling place of the dead. Faces of the dead were covered with cloth and decorated with semi-precious stone. The Western Zhou period is also the period where jade became more important, being used as a protective element that was placed close to bodies. A new type of bronze springing vessel, known as the gué, had become more prominent, while the use of vessels containing alcohol decreased. The decorations of funeral vessels were rather uniform, with the only animal-like creature being portrayed being dragons. Inscriptions were also subject to this uniformity, appealing to descendants to forever preserve and use the vessels for worship. Other than bronze vessels, grave goods included musical items such as musical stones and bells. These bells were typically made of jade or bronze, with the number of each expressing the status of the grave's occupant. There was also differences in burial practices between regional states. For instance, the tomb of Duke Jing of Qin was 24 meters deep, with a complex structure for the outer coffin, and also filled with 166 human victims. The Qin in general had a catacomb model for tombs in which the coffin was posed in a kind of tunnel in which the head of the tomb occupant is turned to the west rather than the north. Qin tombs would also have a dog buried in a waste pit. Qin's lower economic status also made them introduce a practice of replacing old grave items with cheaper surrogates, such as lead and clay imitations of bronze vessels. The Qin would also use wood models of human and animal sacrifice victims, or constructions such as granaries and chariots. Now, to transition to looking at the burial practice of the feudal state on the complete opposite side of the Zhou domain, we will look at the Chou. The Chou were partially of non-Mon descent, which could perhaps explain some of their idiosyncrasies when it comes to their tombs. The tomb of Yi, the Marquis of Zhang, has a multi-compartment or room structure, which is meant to imitate the structure of a palace so the deceased Marquis can continue his habits in death. The 4 rooms of this tomb include 1 for the coffin of the Marquis and 1 for a dog, 1 room which contained musical instruments and ritual vessels, 1 room for the containing of the coffins of 13 concubines, and 1 room containing parts of a chariot, weapons, and even more accompanying humans. Hopefully you have enjoyed this video about the religion of the Zhou.